got to understand, I'm not just living rent free in his head. I'm living rent free in all the people that have lost the debate's head. This is what people are noticing about Trent Horn too. Trent is still mad over a debate 6 years ago. Here's the actual solution. The way out of all this is to actually look at the issues and face up to the issues. You're not going to get the peace that you're looking for by crafting a new intellectual argument to try to solve the challenges from 3, 6, 7 years ago. Because the problem, as Father Deacon always notes, is actually spiritual. It's not an intellectual problem. And that's why this keeps bugging these people, is that they think that they're going to create an intellectual solution to these problems. Let's see what Redeemed Zoomer says is what he should have said all along.
Hey guys, I'm Redeemed Zoomer. So as you guys know, I've gotten back into Protestant apologetics after taking a break from it for about a year, and I've made a lot of videos responding to the claims of Roman Catholicism, explaining why I'm not Catholic. But a lot of you guys have been requesting videos on Eastern Orthodoxy as well, so I will be doing that. But first, I thought I should respond to this debate I did 3 years ago with Dyer. This debate was 3 years ago, but a lot of Orthodox click farm accounts keep re-uploading it, so every 6 months I'll get some message saying, hey Zoomer, thoughts on your recent debate with Dyer? And I'll be like, what recent debate? And then I'll be like, oh wait, somebody re-uploaded it. But no, the
Orthodox click farms. Interesting. So, and this is a sore spot when the debates get uploaded again because people think that they're new debates. So I want to encourage everyone to continue to upload the debates to make these people annoyed and mad. And be sure to clip and upload the Trent Horn debate because he's still 6, 7 years later really mad about it. So here we go.
actual debate was in 2023, and that was before I really read any of the Church Fathers. I mean, I barely read anything.
Oh, so it's 3 years since this, and he's not read any of the Church Fathers, but now he's read, how much can you even read in 3 years? Not a lot. I mean, you could read some, but now he's ready to go back to the debate game.
Was all the books that I had read before that, and ever since then, I've had a chance to read a lot of the Church Fathers.
Okay, well, hold on. Let's see, what was he? So he claims he's read a whole bunch of what looks like 1st and 2nd century Church Fathers here. And then it looks like a little bit of Athanasius. So let's see.
I've had a chance to read
is he saying that he's read all these? We'll have to see.
a lot of the Church Fathers and many other theologians as well. So, as you can imagine, I didn't do very well in this debate. I didn't know who Dyer was, so when my friend Kyle invited me to talk to Dyer, I was like, sure. I looked him up, he's like, he's a comedian. I was like, okay. I didn't realize he was like an expert debater with 20 years of debate experience who went to
Oh, so he's implying that Kyle tricked him or something. Come on, dude.
Reformed seminary and then became Eastern Orthodox. So I didn't answer a lot of these questions very well. There were a lot of times where just I hadn't really heard those arguments before. I hadn't really had a chance to think of what the Reformed response to them would be. So I have selected some key points throughout this debate, some key things I should have said differently. And I'm honestly grateful for this debate because Dyer helped me realize the importance of an authoritative, visible church. And that helped me realize that it's sinful to schism from the main...
Are you serious, dude? A historical, visible church? I mean, who actually thinks that that's going to still be Calvinism? Where was John Calvin's church in the first 1500 years? Come on, dude. So, I mean, has this actually helped him at all? Or has it just sort of helped him to think that he can come up with a new way to make it work?
Church. Like back then, I was in the PCUSA because I thought it was culturally important to stay in mainline churches because we have heritage and buildings and traditional worship and all that. But now I actually...
No, the PCUSA does not have traditional worship. They have buildings. They have heritage and buildings, he said. I think every church has a building, okay? And no, you guys you got to understand. I'm not just living rent-free in his head. I'm living rent-free in all the people that have lost the debate's head. This is what people are noticing about Trent Horn, too. Trent is still mad over a debate 6 years ago. And none of these people, I'm going to tell you guys, here's the actual solution. The way out of all this is to actually look at the issues and face up to the issues. You're not going to get the peace that you're looking for by crafting a new intellectual argument to try to solve the challenges from 3, 6, 7 years ago. Because the problem, as Father Deacon always notes, is actually spiritual. It's not an intellectual problem. And that's why this keeps bugging these people, is that they think that they're going to create an intellectual solution to these problems.
Understand that it's important to have an authoritative visible church from which voluntary schism is sin. And
Okay, what's the authoritative visible church, Redeemed Zoomer, from which it is sinful to schism? My money is on the fact that he will never actually have an epistemic criteria for identifying who that is and from whence they derive their normative authority.
wouldn't have realized that if I hadn't been reading the Church Fathers, reading the Scottish Presbyterian Westminster Divines, and if I hadn't been criticized, rightly, by Orthodox, who pointed out that I had no real coherent ecclesiology. That's the thing. Protestants always get nailed by Catholic and Orthodox debaters when they don't have a clear ecclesiology, when they have what I would call a libertarian ecclesiology, where anyone can start their own church for any reason. But let's get right into it. So the first part of our discussion was the famous Canon conundrum.
What do you think is going to be his solution? I'm going to bet you that he begs the question. And he's going to try to say there's got to be some kind of organized structure of elders or presbyters. Okay, who gave the elders or presbyters in the 1600s that authority?
Canon question. So let's go to that. Intercession itself is not infallible. We rely, because it is possible to rely on fallible.
So the Bible relies on what goes into the books, relies on a thing that is itself fallible, this tradition that you're talking about. So the infallible thing relies on a fallible thing.
Okay, here's an analogy. Your priest is fallible, correct?
Yes.
You can still trust your priest to deliver the faith to you, correct?
Yeah, but this is two different questions: normative authority versus existential authority.
Okay, your reasoning is fallible, correct?
Mm-hmm.
But God still brought you to the church through your reasoning in some sense, correct?
Yeah, but that's a category mistake. So you're confusing two categories. You're confusing the existential with the normative.
So you can see I was confused here. I hadn't really heard the word normative authority before.
So somebody said in the chat that Redeem Coomer says Redeem Coomer thinks he would whip my ass now in a debate. Okay, yeah, fine. Let's do another formal debate because he's going to beat my ass now.
And in my defense, it's a pretty new word. I went on Google Ngram, and it's like you can see
FDA. Apparently, normative authority is a new word. So you're playing tricks here with using these new words.
So crazy.
I mean, dude, it's like it's from philosophy. It's from ethics. Like this is not. Yeah, there's going to be new words in analytical philosophy because they didn't do analytical philosophy in the ancient world. It's like this is a new. He's Googling to see if this is a new word. I think maybe FDA has done a trick on all of us. You're actually conning us with your fancy philosophy words.
Yeah, that's right. It's semantic sorcery. What is philosophy? Listen to my words that I just made up.
Well, you have been on record saying that philosophy is a lot of semantic sorcery. So maybe you're actually doing it with these terms like normative authority.
Yeah, a master sorcerer.
Well, I don't see the word normativity in the Church Fathers. So there you go.
Normative authority is a pretty...
We have this idea. We've come across this before, too, with like the word's not there. It's another variation of the word concept.
Right.
It's like, how dare you actually use language and try to, convey ideas.
Yeah, the word it's the idea that matters, right?
It's absurd.
Well, you couldn't translate the Bible if this was the case, right? Why would you even put the Bible into the vernacular if you couldn't find equivalent concepts that are other languages? It's so silly.
English Bibles, all different words.
Exactly.
Because they're English, yeah.
Recent concept because it has to do with like postmodernism. It's like what's the difference between...
because normative authority occurs in analytical philosophy about postmodernism. That's a postmodern word. This is so low tier, dude.
Normative authority...
I don't even think it's a postmodern word. Like he's just saying this because he looked it up on
analytic philosophers are definitely not postmoderns.
He doesn't know what he's talking about.
He doesn't know.
Central authority, like this wasn't a category in the times of the Reformers. So you can't really...
Actually, it is a category in the times of the Reformers, and I have a book that Perry Robinson recommended about the question of this type of authority during the times of the Reformers.
Well, hey, books are just another example of made-up words, so
Well, this is a Protestant, I think it's an academic book. Dang it, where did I put it, though? I think I put it on the other shelf. Let me find this book. Go ahead.
Tate said books are stupid, Jay.
Who did?
Andrew Tate.
Didn't Tim Pool say something similar too? He's like, I don't read books. Okay, I don't get my information from books. Actually,
books are for stupid people.
Let me see if I have this because this actually would immediately refute what he's talking about. You just heard Redeem Zoomer say that normative authority was not a category at the time of the Reformers. However, in modern day Protestant academic literature, and thanks to Perry Robinson for this recommendation, they actually write books on the problem of authority in the Continental Reformers. So, again, Redeem Zoomer, man, you got to get with what's actually going on in your own literature before you start trying to do these critique responses.
Really blame me for not knowing exactly what normative authority was. I was confused, but I still need to answer that question somehow. The way I would answer that question today is the church, meaning the magisterium of the church, has normative authority to bind you to a decision on the...
The magisterium of the church? What? I mean, I know we speak of the magisterial reformers, and the Roman Catholic Church has an idea of magisterium. But where in his modern Calvinist teaching is there a magisterium of the Calvinist churches? Go ahead, FTA.
Well, it's funny that he's talking to us about this. As far as I know, we don't even use that term.
It's a Western term. I mean, maybe there's a Protestant Calvinist that uses it. I've never heard this used though, but maybe it does exist. But he says it's the magisterium of the church. So is he suddenly a Roman Catholic Calvinist now? Like, what does this mean?
Canon. Even though it's not infallible, there can be fallible normative authorities.
Yeah, but that was just to say what I was saying. So because a authority is fallible, it doesn't mean that it's not an authority. And this is Father Deacon's point that, since Descartes, you have this sort of unrealistic expectation in terms of Enlightenment epistemology of perhaps we'll ground our knowledge in absolute certitude, infallible, indubitable certitude, right? But most modern philosophers and epistemologists, whether they're Christian or not, they tend to not really expect that level of certitude because it's kind of not possible. So I think it might be better to speak of something like the highest possible human certitude, which I would say is things like divine revelation or things like transcendental categories. Those would be my examples. Other things would be lesser types of certitude, but you would still have good warrant to believe those things, right? So in other words, could I have good warrant to believe that my local Orthodox priest probably has a better idea about what Orthodox theology is than other people? Yes. Does that mean that he's infallible? No. But infallibility is not what's required to have normative authority. Go ahead, FJ.
Well, and it's not even required for knowledge to know something. Anyways, go ahead.
So let's listen to him.
That'd be my answer. But let's keep going. My point is that God can use fallible means to deliver infallible authority. The church.
So basically, he conceded the point that I was making. It took him 4 minutes to just concede the point that, yeah, you can have normative authority. Okay, thank you. Now he says, but that's not needed but the problem is that for the Protestant Calvinist, the Protestant Bible is the only infallible authority, you see. That's the problem here. So his own Calvinist confessions relegate the text of Scripture to the only infallible authority. That's the point here. So really, he's just struggling with kind of getting a basic distinction that he didn't get in the debate, and he's admitting that. But is he going to be able to address the fact that classical Reformation teaching equates infallibility only to the Protestant canonical texts?
Is fallible. The church is the fallible means by which God distributed the infallible authority of the Scriptures.
With multiple canons, there's a development, as you admitted, over multiple centuries. How do you know that the 4th, 5th, 6th century decision, which, by the way, is not the Protestant canon, it includes the Deuterocanon, when Trullo in the 7th...
Now, that's not exactly true. The Orthodox today still don't have a uniform canon. Some people use the canon...
So again, he's expecting that the Orthodox have to have the same statement on what the canon is to make it, quote, a canon, as if we're supposed to have the Protestant doctrine of sola scriptura. For the Orthodox position, there's nothing wrong with a little bit of flexibility about the Russian Bibles and what they have in their canon, or, could you say that the Book of Enoch is not canonical but has some true tradition? Same with Proto-Evangelium of James, of course. But that's not a problem for our position when it's loose, a little bit loose and flexible. It is a problem for his position. So now he's going back to saying, you don't have a canon because you have flexibility. No. The fact that there's flexibility does not mean we don't have a canon. It just means it's not your conception of a sola scriptura version of the canon.
Trollo, which includes the Deuterocanon, but some people like St. Philaret of Moscow in the 1600s or Orthodox Dogmatic Theology by Michael Pomazanski actually still use the 66-book Protestant canon.
That is also not true. You can read the Catechism of Philaret itself, and it says we simply call these other books, which we do use, Deuterocanon. The word Deuterocanon means secondary canon. You can go all the way back to St. Athanasius, and St. Athanasius says, yeah, they're deuterocanonical. They're a secondary canon. That means they don't have as much importance than the other books have. So just like the Gospels have a preeminence in the liturgy, it doesn't mean because the Gospels have a preeminence that we don't follow Paul's epistles, right? Paul's epistles are read, and the other apostles' epistles are read in the readings in the liturgy, but they're not given the preeminence that the Gospels are given. So there's a tier of authority and importance and hierarchy, just like we still read the Torah, we still read the prophets, but the Gospels have preeminence over that. So none of that means, though, that we don't have the Deuterocanon. We do. And even Metropolitan Philaret's Catechism says they're a Deuterocanon, secondary canon. Doesn't mean they're not in the canon. So it's just a basic misunderstanding. And he's just pulling from the standard Protestant and Roman Catholic low tier gotchas against us. But let's look at what Philaret's canon actually, his catechism says. So he left out, as you can see here, what Philaret goes on to say about the deuterocanonical texts. He goes on to say, what about these last books? Athanasius says they are to be appointed, and the fathers to be read to the proselytes preparing for admission into the church. Do any Calvinists read the deuterocanonical texts to prepare their converts for admission into the Catholic Church? No. And he left this out. Why would he leave this out? Because he went from a Protestant or Catholic gotcha as if this was a gotcha, when the rest of the catechism goes on to say they are not canonical in the same way as the other books, but they are still canonical because they're read to the catechumens. We wouldn't catechize people with the books if they weren't part of the canon. So he should have done more homework.
Canon. And the Orthodox say it's like kind of like oikonomia. It's like you could do this, you could do that. So at least Protestants have an agreed upon canon, which the Orthodox don't. But let's keep it.
Yeah, but again, that's just assuming that your argument is correct and that there must be a fixed, absolutely, quote, infallible canon. When we don't make that argument, you do. So he's doing he's basically trying to argue the Protestant position onto the Orthodox conception of the canon, which again is, yeah, but we don't accept what you think canon means and what it must be epistemically. So he should have done a little more research on that, but let's see where he goes next.
Council affirmed the Orthodox canon. How do you know that that's the wrong canon? Because you don't have that canon. You have a different canon.
Are you talking about like the differences between the Protestant and Orthodox canons today? Yeah, so the problem of different canons is not solved just because you're Orthodox, because the Orthodox and the Catholics and the Ethiopians have different canons from each other. So how do you know the Catholics aren't right?
Well, I have an argument because I believe in the normative authority of the church. And if you don't believe in the normative authority of the church, it's a problem for you, not for me.
Okay, I believe in the normative authority of the church. Back then, I didn't know what that was. I believe the church has the authority to determine the canons, in a sense. I think that
Which church?
the church community. There are schisms when people can't agree on certain things. But yeah, so back then I had more of the ecumenist mindset, and I wasn't willing to say my church community, my church communion is.
He just mentioned magisterium a minute ago. So what Catholic or what Calvinist church teaches the idea of a Protestant magisterium?
Authoritative in a unique way. So I would say the communion of mainline Protestantism, which includes 300 million.
The communion of mainline Protestants. So this is what he's gone to now. He said a minute ago he was more ecumenist, and he's saying now the mainline Protestant communion. There's no such thing as the mainline Protestant communion. This is a complete fiction. It doesn't exist. Do you think Anabaptists are in communion with high church Anglicans? This is so low tier and stupid, dude.
Members globally, and most of it's not liberal, as J. Dyer knows, because he believes large jurisdictions of the Orthodox Church are hijacked. He knows that jurisdictions of the church can be hijacked, and it can still be.
Yeah, but this is a false equivalence, because even if there are liberal jurisdictions of the Orthodox Church, that's still decentralized. You could have a based Greek Orthodox priest, and you could have a liberal Rocor priest. So it has nothing really to do with the jurisdictions, as if jurisdictions are equivalent to Protestant denominations. No, they're not. You can go to an Orthodox church, which will teach you the same doctrine, the same liturgy across the board, regardless of the individual priests. You won't even get correct Christology or Trinitarian theology or ecclesiology amongst the thousands of Protestant sects. This is absolutely an insane equivalence here. Oh, I'm in communion with a magisterium of Protestants? Protestants are not even in communion. This is a completely made up fiction. I mean, Luther would kill Anabaptists over baptism. So the fact that today's Protestant gibberish world doesn't kill each other, it doesn't make them in communion because they're not killing each other. And where was the idea that there's a general Protestant communion? Who even came up with this? That's actually an ecumenist idea. I mean, maybe he could go to Anglican branch theory, but he's not an Anglican. And Anglicans now have a TRANZ bishops and women bishops. They just elected a woman head of the Church of England. By the way, they already, for those that don't know, hold on. For those that don't know, they already had a woman head of the church, Queen Elizabeth. The Queen was the official head of the church. So they already had a woman church. Go ahead.
It's like shape-shifting theology.
Exactly.
Well, now I'm this because I'm going to use this to make my argument, and now
no, he literally
went. I'm over here now.
He literally went to, quote, seminary. I don't know if he's a Reformed Theological Seminary or Westminster, wherever he went, to try to figure out a way to make it work. It's system building.
The church during that time, because of the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew and his ecumenism. J. Dyer has pointed that out, and he knows that that does not invalidate the...
Yeah, this is a false equivalence between ecumenism within the Orthodox Church as an error versus thousands of different Protestant sects that disagree on fundamental teachings like the deity of Christ. By the way, the PCUSA had a statement denying and questioning the deity of Christ even in the 1960s. So this has been a long-time problem in the Protestant world. To equate that to the patriarch being a liberal is a false equivalence.
Orthodox Church. So liberalism within the mainline Protestant communion, especially if it's not the majority, would not invalidate the mainline Protestant communion. So I would...
There is no mainline Protestant communion. That's a completely made-up fiction.
Say the community that decides the scriptures...
By the way, the very idea of communion, that means Eucharistic celebration. It's divorced from the even historic meaning of the word communion. When the post-apostolic fathers talk about, like Ignatius or Irenaeus, they talk about us all partaking of one bread because we're one body. It's talking about Eucharistic communion. How are you going to be in communion with groups that reject the Eucharist? Baptists do not believe in a Eucharist. They do not have an altar. How are you going to be in communion with people that don't have an altar? They reject that idea. Classical Protestantism is premised on rejecting a Eucharistic altar. So what does he mean by communion? He's updated the term to mean all the Protestants out there that have a basic idea of Jesus is Lord or some nonsense like that. That's not what communion means. It's not an intellectual assent to propositions. It's a Eucharistic, ecclesial, episcopal communion. So he doesn't even know that.
Is the true church, which is mainline Protestantism, and we have decided...
The true church is mainline Protestantism. Mainline Protestant. This is so low tier. I can't believe anybody would actually fall for this. There is no such thing as mainline Protestantism that all the Protestant sects share. It doesn't exist. He is inventing a position intellectually to make his system work because he's too prideful to admit that he's wrong.
On a 66-book canon of Scripture, and I assent to the normative authority.
Protestants across the board don't actually agree on a 66-book canon because the Anglican Church has always included the Deuterocanon. So he doesn't even know that.
Of the mainline Protestant Church, my jurisdiction of which is the peace.
By the way, if he wants to split hairs and say, well, the Anglicans may have included it, but it's not official. It doesn't matter because Luther and Calvin rejected the Deuterocanon because it had doctrines like prayers for the dead or good works necessary for salvation. So even if the Anglicans include it, it's still a problem for him because according to Luther, it teaches heresy. So who's right? Is it okay as an Anglican to have the Deuterocanonical text and Maccabees and prayers for the dead? Or is that heresy and Luther's correct? It shouldn't be canonical. So this is just silly made up nonsense.
PCUSA. I would say...
Did the PCUSA it's like the biggest gay church on the planet. And now it's the Episcopals. So this guy was defending the biggest gay church out there because he's a young guy, he's ignorant, he's zealous, he doesn't know, zeal without knowledge. And now he's matured his position to be, okay, I don't like the PCUSA anymore. So that's all that came out of all this was, okay, I don't like the PCUSA. Now I'm a part of mainline Protestantism. Okay, but the PCUSA is part of mainline Protestantism, as is the Anglican Church, which has trained in Skittles bishops and women bishops. How are you in communion with people that are women bishops? There's no such thing as a woman bishop. How could you be in communion with something that is not a thing? What the hell is even that?
I would say that
his older arguments were actually better, somebody said. Exactly. Maybe, perhaps.
Church, which includes the Protestant church today, has the authority to make their best decision on the canon. And maybe it won't be an infallible authority. It's like they can't all be right. But
okay, so now he said, originally he said the canon is fallible. Well, that was the whole point, right? If your only thing that's infallible is the 66 books of the Protestant canon, but it turns out the canon is actually fallible, then it doesn't work to say it's an infallible list. It's a fallible collection of infallible books. That's nonsense.
Oh, hold on. Now you're saying that the Protestants today can participate in deciding the canon, but you've already
Yes, because we're the church.
admitted that it was a decision based on.
So wait a minute. Now Protestants are the church. Didn't we see with this first guy that called in, the Catholic guy? He said Jesus prayed that the church would be one. I guess his prayer failed because nobody in their right mind could admit that the Protestant church is one. So he's made up an even stupider position than trying to be a PCUSA guy.
In the past.
Now, if we're talking about like the New Testament canon or the Old Testament canon, like
Either one.
the New Testament canon, that delivers the teachings of the apostles. And all the churches agree on that today. The Old Testament canon, there has been debates throughout all churches.
Why? Because all today's groups agree on something. Does that make it true for the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th century?
So let's assume that, yeah, I was trying to appeal to like this undivided early church, but the undivided early church didn't even really agree on the canon then. And it doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, but that's to my point. If you're now admitting that the church didn't agree on the canon in the first 5, 6 centuries, then you've admitted the point I made in the argument that the church cannot be governed by sola scriptura, and it wasn't governed by sola scriptura. That was the point.
To say, oh, before the church is divided, it has normative authority to decide the canon, but after it's divided, it doesn't. The church has always had the same normative authority ever since the post-app.
Yeah, the comments are saying he actually sounded like he was ignorant before, but now he sounds delusional. This is an even worse direction. I commented on his video that he should debate you again. Yeah, it's even worse now. And so this is the thing with heresy and prelast is that it blinds you, and pride is what causes you to double, triple, quadruple down, which puts you in even worse positions.
Apostolic age began. So yeah, that was the debate about the canon. So now let's talk about normative authority in general.
You're not bound by confessions.
Yeah, we are. We have confessions.
Your confessions say that no post-apostolic creed, council, or confession can bind.
Well, that's not what the confessions say. The confessions say we cannot be bound to anything that cannot be found in Scripture. But
yeah, that's the thing in question, dude. Come on. Obviously, every person is going to say their position is found in Scripture. So just saying, yeah, but it's by what's found in Scripture. That's the point about the right of private interpretation in the classical Reformation doctrines, right? The classical Reformation confessions have the idea, which was a Protestant distinctive, that no pope, council, or magisterium or cardinal can tell me what I derive from Scripture. I have the, quote, right, and here's this Enlightenment classical liberal idea of, quote, rights, right? You've heard Andrew critique countless leftists and lunatics out here because they all worship this idea of magical rights. Okay, what are those? Where are those? And how do we know what they are? And they always end up just go, well, this is what the state says. So basically just default to statism. The Protestants were having a similar tendency at the time of the Reformation to say, I have a right of private interpretation because no one can bind my conscience. Well, do you think that at the Council of Nicaea, they thought that everybody has the right of private interpretation and no one can bind their conscience when they excommunicate the Arians? No, you're bound by this interpretation. And if you don't accept it, well, then you're outside of the church. You've left. So he's, again, equivocating and deflecting from, he's got to know that this is a Protestant Reformation distinctive, right? I mean, I was in the Calvinist sphere for years. I was always talking about this. Yeah, we have a right of private interpretation. No, man. And it sounds powerful, right? Like, yeah, I agree with Luther, right? Nobody could you can't trample my conscience. I got the right of private interpretation. Okay, but does the Bible and do the church fathers and the councils teach that you have the right of private interpretation? That's the question here, right? And I'm asking him, why do you think you have that? And how are you going to have normative authority when you also have the doctrine of the right of private interpretation? That's the dilemma I'm putting him in. Surely he can get that, right?
The institutional church can and does bind the conscience to things.
Oh, so now the institutional church that can bind consciences. Okay, is this the same institutional Protestant sects that are Episcopal trans bishops and Methodist gay bishops and Baptist Anabaptists? I mean, what is the institutional church? I mean, I would argue perhaps we could look at the stats because I might be wrong, but my guess would be that the numbers of Protestants worldwide now is probably evangelicals that are more or less the radical Reformation descendants, right? I've been making this argument. If you didn't see the stream on Testament of Ann Lee, I recommend it. It's in the member section. But if the majority of mainline Protestants is basically the inheritance of the radical Reformation, charismatics, Pentecostals, that's all Anabaptist stuff, then it's not the classical magisterial Reformation, which he's trying to harken back to. Now, again, the Anabaptist radical Reformation people were put to death by the magisterial reformers. Okay? Do we understand this? Did you know that in England, the royalists and the cavaliers went to war over whether or not you should have a king or a republic? In fact, the Westminster Confession was forged partly out of the dispute between this question: Rex Lex or Lex Rex? And yes, I've read those old English Calvinist debates. I have some of those books still. So he's giving you this modern invention of an idea of all the Protestants as an institution communing together and having normative authority. This is so silly. Anybody taking this seriously is just completely stupid. There's no way to make that work or make sense. It's totally ahistorical when these groups literally killed each other, not just over baptism, but should we have a king or a constitutional republic?
That are in Scripture. For example, the Presbyterian Church can and has bound people to the doctrine of the Trinity because we believe it's in Scripture. However,
Yeah, but in the Protestant world, I can say my right of private interpretation. No one can trample my conscience. This is what Servetus argued. When Calvin had Servetus burned, yeah, he thought he had the power, and he did, I guess, actually have the power to have Servetus burned. Servetus said, I don't see the Trinity in Scripture. I have the right of private interpretation. Go ahead.
Do you know what the problem is? I've seen this argument before where Protestants will just say, and particularly Presbyterians, oh, we have normative authority. I'm like, well, you have authority, but you don't have a normative authority because, again, you accept the right of private judgment. But it's something more akin to if you worked at Home Depot and your name was Juan Valdez. You work at Home Depot anyways, and they have an authority, right? They can kick you out and say and fire you and say you're not. But you can just go to Lowe's. I'm going to Lowe's, so there's nothing that actually binds you. But think about this. That's when we speak about normative authority, we make more of a legal analogy. If Lewis and Clark County, right, the judge declares me guilty on something.
Mm-hmm.
I can't just go pick up and go, well, I'm going to Jefferson County. You know, I'm actually going to go skip state, and your judgment doesn't bind me because now I'm over here. That's what you can do as a Protestant is with the analogy of the businesses. It's like they can fire you and kick you out, but you can just go to work at Lowe's.
Yeah, and Protestant churches are business church,
But
so
in
great
the
analogy.
history of the church, it's more analogous to the legal. You can appeal, right? Like, so you could go up to the Montana Supreme Court after, let's say, like the county judge declares you guilty or something like that. But you can't say, well, that doesn't apply to me because I'm moving over to the next county or the next state. And so they play with this notion of authority. And what they really mean is something more kind of like a corporate authority.
Yeah, and by the way, my argument was not Protestants never claimed to have elders or authorities. That was not the argument. The argument was if you have a doctrine of the right of private interpretation and the freedom of conscience, and you also have the idea of normative authority, then you're in a bind because one of those has to give. You can't have both of those. You can't have every layman having the right to interpret the scriptures for himself and a normative authority that can bind people's consciences. It's those are mutually exclusive ideas. And obviously the fruits of the Protestant Reformation show that this does not work. So he's just simply doing, this is what the Thomists do this all the time, right? If you call out a contradiction in Thomism, well, look over here, Aquinas says something correct. Look over here, we admit there's authorities. I wasn't arguing that you don't have authorities. My argument was that it's a contradiction to have the right of private interpretation, freedom of conscience, and freedom of worship, and the idea of normative authority. Because every group is going to say, well, my doctrine's taught in the scriptures, right? That's why it doesn't work to just say, appeal to the scriptures. And that he just admitted that. He said, well, yeah, but it has to do with what you can prove from the scriptures. Well, Servetus thought he could prove Arianism from the scriptures, right? That's why Calvin had to say, we don't care about your interpretation. You're going to the stake, bro. Get you some barbecue sauce. We're about to have a little Cervitas meat.
Presbyterian Church cannot bind someone to observing a certain holiday, which is not in Scripture. So if a certain Presbyterian wants to stay home...
So you notice the false equivalence there that he just did? He said a Presbyterian can bind your conscience to the Trinity, but they can't bind your conscience to church feast days. Oh, really? But you understand that both the feast days and the doctrine of the Trinity are a logical deduction from the teaching of the Scriptures, and that's the thing in question. Who decides which interpretation is authentic and correct? That's the point. Protestantism is built on the idea that there's no man that can bind your conscience to their interpretation. And it doesn't matter that they think, well, but I like the doctrine of the Trinity, and that one should be one of them. That's the argument. It's arbitrary. It's a contradiction between those two principles. You either have to give up the so-called right of private interpretation, which, by the way, where does that come from? Where do you get the idea that a Christian or an individual has the right to interpret the Scriptures for himself? I don't see that anywhere in the history of the Old Testament believers. It's not in the New Testament. It doesn't exist amongst the church fathers. So that is the Reformation distinctive. That is a new doctrine. Do you think Athanasius or Irenaeus as bishops would tell their flock, guys, remember, I might be a bishop, I might have apostolic succession, but you all have the right to interpret the Scriptures as you see fit? Of course not. It doesn't exist. That's the point.
On Christmas, doesn't want to go to church on Christmas, the Presbyterian Church does not have the authority to bind their conscience and say you must go to church on Christmas. But if someone wants...
I have to say this one because it's another contradiction. Does he not know in the classical Reformation Westminster Confession documents, maybe he hasn't even read those, you're not even supposed to celebrate Christmas. The traditional Presbyterian Calvinist view is against holy days. I don't think he knows that. That would actually be an interesting point to bring up, that actually your church did previously think that it could bind people's consciences to not celebrating Christmas or having images or icons. Now, your Calvinist Presbyterian church tolerates people going to Christmas and having images and icons. So that's another evolution of inconsistency that, again, shows the fruits of your silly position.
Wants to deny the Trinity, not only can the Presbyterian Church excommunicate someone for that,
yeah, why? What is the basis for saying the church, quote unquote church, can excommunicate you for denying the Trinity, but not denying Christmas as a feast day? He's going to say, the Scriptures. That was the point, dude. I know you're going to appeal to the Scriptures. Every heretic appeals to the Scriptures. Servetus appealed to the Scriptures against John Calvin. So you either have to give up the right of private interpretation, which doesn't exist and is made up, or normative authority. You can't have both. It doesn't make any sense.
The Presbyterian Church has excommunicated many people for that.
Yeah, but that's not what we're asking. I'm asking for the contradiction between these two principles to solve that mutually exclusive contradiction.
It depends on what you mean by bind. It's like, it's not infallible in the same way that the Bible is, but it's still authoritative. It's like a pastor. A pastor is not infallible. A pastor is still an authority. Yes, past Zoomer, but that's irrelevant. The question isn't fallible versus infallible. It's still...
But at least he's debating past Zoomer here. At least he's admitting that he's wrong.
Does the church have the authority to make binding decisions upon pain of excommunication, which luckily the Presbyterian Church does.
Okay, this is taking a long time. I'm going to see if we get to a new topic. Let's skip ahead a little bit because it's getting boring. Tedious here. Let's see where he goes next. Oh, come on now.
Sin, especially the whole old school, new school controversy. The Presbyterian Church kicked out 3 presbyteries that were not being orthodox enough. So, yeah.
So, he's moving on to original sin. Let's see where else he goes.
Anyway, so normative authority is important, and luckily, traditional Presbyterians believe the institutional church, as the institutional church, has binding normative authority.
Yeah, what is the institution? We could just move this problem back a step and say, okay, what's the actual authoritative Reformed Presbyterian institution? Now, I have to make this comment as well because I was in this world. And anybody who knows this world, let's be honest, and I want you to be honest too, Redeemed Zoomer, if you're watching this. In the Presbyterian world, you know damn well there's not an institution of the Presbyterian Church. You know that the RPCUS hates the RPCNA, and they hate the PCA, and they all disagree with the OPC. These are all the minuscule factions of the Calvinist Presbyterian sects. And for you to act like they're all on the same page because they claim to have the Westminster Confession when they disagree about fundamentals. For example, the RPCNA schismed and would not accept the PCA or the OPC over things like hymns. There's a huge debate in the history of Calvinism over musical instruments. Strict Presbyterians will not have instruments, and they will only sing psalmody. It's a controversy called the psalmody only controversy or no hymns controversy. They will schism over that. They schism over Reconstructionism. Bonson and Rushdoony. Are you pro-Reconstructionist or anti-Reconstructionist? Do you like Jim Jordan or do you reject Jim Jordan? Do you want paedo communion like whatever was the controversy that started the Doug Wilson sect? Doug Wilson's whole sect comes out of the debates over paedo communion. And then Doug Wilson, as the Pope of his own sect, says, we're going to allow you to commune as a Baptist and not give your children communion, but you can also commune with the Presbyterians who believe in paedo communion. This is so insane. And anybody who knows that ridiculous world knows that they will split over the color of the carpet and create a new presbytery over the color of the carpet. I'm not joking. They'll split over that. Oh, I'm in the RPCNA CDXYZ, right? And there's 5 of us and we're the real presbytery. So this is all silly. It's so silly. And he's got to know this, right? About modern Presbyterianism. I was in that world. And that's what it's really like. It's as crazy as the Sedevacantists world, okay? So, no, there is not an institutional Presbyterian church. There's 1,000 different presbyteries that all hate and disagree with each other and schism over the stupidest stuff.
Now let's just talk about Presbyterianism, Presbyterians, and bishops and stuff. It's still debated. It's like the best scholarship, best neutral scholarship says that in some regions there was episcopacy, in some regions there was Presbyterian government. Eventually the episcopacy won out.
Oh, like scholars like who?
Okay, at this point, I just had heard these things in a few places. I didn't
have any actual basis. I just said it. So I was repeating what I heard.
know which scholars, which church fathers. Which scholars? John Henry Newman, who is Roman Catholic. He's a doctor.
Oh, so wait a minute. Your source is John Henry Newman, the Roman Catholic? To argue that the episcopacy developed? I mean, well, that would prove development of doctrine. That would prove Romanism, like John Henry Newman's version of Romanism. So that's a terrible source.
Doctor of the Roman Catholic Church. He admits the early church had a more Presbyterian structure. That the
So why does any Orthodox person or Protestant person care what John Henry Newman said? That'd be like me going to a Muslim debate and citing, I don't know, who do Muslims hate? David Wood. It'd be like me citing David Wood in a Muslim debate. It'd be like, they don't care what David Wood says. Like, it's such a silly line of argument. He's all over the place, man. He's gotten into even worse position.
bishops were developments, the episcopacy was a development, and the papacy was a development. And because he's Captain Development of Doctrine, he thinks that, even if the early church did resemble Protestantism in some ways, Catholicism has the most organic development, so that's why we should all be Catholic.
Okay, but again, irrelevant. Who cares what John Henry Newman says? Moving ahead.
If you have the equivalent belief, it doesn't really matter.
So this is the first time I've ever heard of this. I've always rejected monoenergism, monothelitism, while holding to a Calvinist view of conversion. I've never...
Monergism is monoenergism. It's equivalent. It's a logical deduction. I don't know what he's talking about here. We're talking about Christology, but my argument was that monergism in Christology is, for example, monoenergism in soteriology, and argument's been made many times over.
Seen any contradiction? I don't think there is any contradiction.
That's an anthropological view that's monoenergism, right? Don't you believe the divine grace has to overcome the human will?
Providentially, God changes the human heart, yes. Okay, so Jay is right that monergism is monoenergism. I spoke to my seminary professor about this.
Okay, I mean, it's great that you're speaking to your seminary professor, but it's like, are you not going to do the reading? I mean, go and do the Christological reading. Don't just take the words of some random dude. I mean, go and read the text.
And the answer he gave is, Calvinists are just not monergists. Monergism is one of those things like tulip or the five solas.
Yeah, that is Calvinism. You will find in most Calvinist systematic theologies and dogmatic texts the teaching of monergism. I don't know what he's talking about here. This is Calvinism 101. I was a Calvinist for a long time. I went to Bonson Seminary. Calvinists are monergists. They teach monergism,
which is invented in like the 19th, 20th centuries to try and summarize the Calvinist or Protestant view of things. But no, the Reformed tradition is not historically monergist.
That is not true. That is a blatant error. And he needs to do the readings himself and not just rely on what his professor says. Let's see. I will guarantee you in Bavinck or Charles Hodge or any of the classical Calvinist systematic theologies, they will talk about monergism. So Berkhoff, I forgot Berkhoff. Calvin emphasized that grace is entirely efficacious. That's monergism. Louis Berkhoff in his systematic theology says that Calvinism's doctrine of regeneration is monergist. Francis Turretin, the famous dogmatic scholastic Calvinist, regeneration is an act of God alone. That's monergism. So again, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't even know the classical Reformation teachings. And by the way, I have all of these systematic theologies on my shelf. I have all my Calvinist books still. I guarantee you, I mean, it's not hard to find this out. Calvinists call their websites monergism.com. What are you talking about? This website has been around since I was a Calvinist. Like, dude, they call the websites monergism.com, bro. They wouldn't do that if Calvinists didn't teach monergism. Let's see if Calvinists at monergism.com they don't even have a headline of monergism. But I mean, again, the doctrine of regeneration in Calvinism is literally the same thing as monergism. That's what it means. You don't participate in being regenerated. Duh. That's monergism, dude. What are you talking about?
We believe in what's called dual intent. So I would say a strict monergism says that it's 100% God and 0% you. God just overrides you. God's will overrides your will. And you can see how that would sort of be monoenergist, because it implies that there cannot be a cooperation between the divine will and the human will. And if that's the case, then Jesus, who is one person, couldn't have had
Salvation right there, son.
Yeah, I mean, again, all Calvinists that I've ever heard of stress that God is the sole actor in regeneration. Now, they might get specific and say God efficaciously moves the human will, but the whole point of being dead in sin is that regeneration is just as much a one-sided miraculous action of God as a bodily resurrection. That's literally what Calvinistic monergism is supposed to be about. Now, maybe his professor is attuned to recent Calvinist disputes, and maybe there's a lot of disputes and things that happening in Calvinist Protestant worlds where they're actually trying to do in a lot of different things. For example, Southern Baptist Theological Seminary is literally trying to bring Thomism into their apologetics. I'm not joking. I went to Southern Seminary a few years ago and I was walking around on campus. I was debating some of the people that happened to be around. By the way, Father Damick called me out for doing that. No Orthodox person should go to a Protestant campus and debate. I don't know why we wouldn't, but and a lot of the guys I talked to who were getting their master's and their PhD in seminary or in theology at Southern Seminary in Louisville said we've actually had a huge revolution here where we're bringing Thomism into SBS theology. So it could be the case that amongst modern Calvinist scholastics that they're having some sort of debate about, no, we actually need to give some place for the human will. But who cares? That's not even the classical Calvinist teaching, right? So remember, like Father Deacon just pointed out, these guys can always just shift and move and create a new position because they're not actually bound by anything historical. Now, he says you're bound by the Trinity and all this. He doesn't believe the Cappadocian doctrine of the Trinity. He teaches the Augustinian heretical doctrine of the Trinity. So, no.
Two wills. Jesus couldn't have had a divine will and a human will, but the Sixth Ecumenical Council that Jay brings up, it did teach officially that Jesus has two wills. Jesus has a human will and a divine will, and that's the mainstream Chalcedonian position. But if you think they're incompatible, which you do think that if you think that salvation has to be 100% God, 0% us, then that is monoenergist. The synergist view would be that it's sort of like partly God, partly you. So God does his part, but you kind of have to do your part as well. Calvinists aren't exactly synergist either. The way my seminary professor puts it is dual intent. And his Bible verse for that is work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is he who works in you. So,
yeah, but that's not classical Calvinistic monergism. So again, you can see here at, Reformed websites that have been here for 30 years since I was a Calvinist, literally it will equate Calvinism with God is the sole actor and cause in regeneration. That is Calvinism. So the fact that he's got a professor who's trying to make this a little more amenable and palatable is, again, really irrelevant to what classical Calvinism is.
But, where was Lazarus's human will and energy when Jesus raised him from the dead? So yes, it is a monergistic or monoenergistic act of God that...
Well, thank you. That's exactly what we're saying. So you just admitted that it's monergistic right there.
Frees our will from slavery to sin. But once that happens, then there is full cooperation between the divine and the human will.
Yeah, but the doctrine of regeneration is not a synthesis or a cooperation. So he just admitted that it's monergistic in regeneration. That was my argument, dude.
Jesus does not just make sick people well, Jesus makes dead people alive, just like he did with Lazarus. So that's what Calvinism teaches. All right, now here's another key.
That would be monergism. Making a dead person alive? If you're dead, you don't participate in it. Duh.
Another key debate, this idea that Calvinism teaches that Jesus was damned on the cross, and then either that's Nestorian or that splits the Trinity. So let's listen to that part.
Because the other big problem that I see with Reformed theology, and maybe you don't teach this, classical Reformation teaching, whether it's Calvin, Luther, Charles Hodge, John Murray, J.I. Packer, R.C. Sproul, they all teach that Christ on the cross was damned.
Okay, he says like the classical Reformation teaching, and he lists like one classical Reformation theologian, which is Calvin himself. And remember...
No, I said Luther, and I mentioned other Calvinists, and let's go to these actual comments here. Here is, for example, and this modern Calvinist that still maintain this teaching, and I know because as a Calvinist and as a fan of Luther back in my Protestant days, I would argue this all the time. So here is, for example, John Piper saying, when Jesus cried, my God, why have you forsaken me? It was the scream of the damned. Jesus was damned in our place. That's Desiring God blog here. You can find this right. I'll give you guys this link here. Lorraine Bettner, famous Calvinist systematic theologian here. Jesus was separated from God. He experienced the pangs of hell. That is everything that is good and desirable. Such suffering is beyond our comprehension. He suffered an eternity in hell. John MacArthur says the same thing. The punishment was the outpouring of God's wrath. The Father poured all of the wrath against sin on the Son on the cross. John MacArthur again, saying the same thing here. Here's John Calvin. Nothing had been done if Christ had only endured a physical, corporeal death. That's the Orthodox position, that he underwent separation of his human soul from his human body. That's the Orthodox position. He's not damned. But Christ endured in the sight of man what the Creed says, the incomprehensible judgment of God. This is John Calvin in the Institutes, book 3, chapter 16, section 10. By the way, this Catholic guy's blog is all my posts. He got all this from me, right? The body of Christ was given as a price, but there was a greater price. He bore the tortures of the condemned. He bore the tortures in his soul of the condemned. There's John Calvin right there. Charles Hodge, famous Catholic or Calvinist systematic theologian. Christ suffered the penalty of the law. He suffered eternal death. He must have. That's the thing that was due to us. Right there. He was cast off from God. Martin Luther. Christ himself suffered the dread horror of eternal wrath on the cross. Martin Luther, cited by Calvinist J.I. Packer, right there. Wayne Grudem, Baptist Calvinist, systematic theologian. Christ was damned, right there. R.C. Sproul, Christ was damned. You are accursed. He was under the anathema of the Father. I don't understand that, Sproul says, but it is true. John Piper again saying it. Calvinist C.J. Mahaney, Christ was damned in our place. John Piper again. These are just selections, right? This is a very well-known, common Calvinist teaching. And it's Luther and Calvin and most of the Calvinist tradition, as far as I'm aware, when they talk about it. Now, maybe not every Calvinist theologian even discusses this, but when they discuss it, they're very explicit and very clear. So him acting like this is some unheard of thing is false.
Calvin is a lawyer, not a scholastic, so sometimes he uses sloppy language to make a point.
Yeah, but it's not just Calvin. It's the rest of the Calvinist divines, dude. Come on.
But no, Calvinists do not teach that Jesus was literally damned on the cross.
Yes, you do. Here is your divines. John Piper, Lorraine Bettner, John MacArthur, Calvin himself, Charles Hodge, J.I. Packer, Wayne Grudem, R.C. Sproul. You absolutely teach it right here. He's full of it. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
And that damnation.
What we believe is he suffered spiritually. He suffered the spiritual penalty equivalent to damnation.
There, he just admitted the thing he denied. He wasn't damned on the cross. He experienced the spiritual equivalence of damnation on the cross. Yeah, that splits the Trinity. So every argument I've ever made still holds. Alex, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just briefly, because I recently got into a tiff with Jordan Cooper on this. I did like a parody video on him recently, but I used a few of your quotes and I site checked them, and lo and behold, they do actually say what you say they say, even with all the context. And I've noticed they're making a move of running to Francis Turretin lately. So I looked up his work on the atonement as well. And he actually has some of the worst language that I've seen on this topic. He says that the Father withheld the beatific vision from the Son, as if this somehow helps them, and that the Father withheld the full fruition of felicity between the Father and the Son.
So it's still
like
anti-Trinitarian.
some of the most damning language I've seen. It doesn't help them at all.
Good. Yeah, I didn't actually know that Turretin went to that depth. That's good.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. So again, massive fail here. Let's move on towards the end of this. See where he goes to the end of it.
Then it's Nestorian. No, it's not Nestorian to say the person of the Son died according to his human nature, not according to his divine nature. So you can also say the person of the Son was punished according to his human nature, not according to his divine nature.
Again, if you say the punishment is spiritual death and damnation, or the equivalence of it, that is equated to Arianism or Nestorianism. So he just still doesn't understand nature, person in the Trinity, and he doesn't understand that the Son is a divine subject. So yeah, the Son undergoes death in his human nature, meaning the severance of the human soul from the human body. That's how John Damascus defines what happens on the cross. There is no spiritual death or damnation because he's a divine person.
I don't see any issue with that. Okay.
Well, he doesn't see the issue because he doesn't understand. Calvinists are Nestorian. They don't even realize it. This is a Christological heresy.
Last section will be on the true church. What is the true church? And this is where you can see my ecclesiology then was very weak and fluffy. It is the true church.
Bro, it's even worse now because you said it's all of the Protestant churches in a magisterial communion. That doesn't exist. That's made up.